The research topic I'm working on, which is also the title of the talk, is the chain male gaze, and that will hopefully become a bit clearer as time goes on. So I wanted to start with a little palate cleanser. This is a short piece of speculative fiction that I've written around one of the topics that we're going to explore in this short presentation. Decentralization has a cost, the price of anarchy. The price is always due, but the rewards weren't cheap to reap. So solid CCRU. What most did not expect was that the payment would become due at the grandest scales of governance. The Westphalia state, forged under the fire of peer Prussia, was ambushed by upstart modes of power, opening new vistas of communication, commodification, and communion. The orientations that nation-states used to enshrine their power only made it easier to undermine them. The bigger they were, the harder they fell. Rextopia, the European Union, NATO's cave, the United States machine, all returned to dust. The decline of the nation-state in the Roaring Twenties became a canon of canonicity for an entire generation of soul traders. It wasn't even just the bit leavers. In those days, there were many networks, many messiahs, many ideologics, all with their own profit motives. The imaginary countries were myriad. Most barely lasted a year, typically weeks, always due to the toxic masculinity of their power vacuum suckers. The experts that greased their way up the slimy poles of the agora were born again as sociopaths, just as the politicians that came before them. Though these initiatives were in themselves ineffectual and dysfunctional, they sufficiently destabilized the inflexible structures that preceded them. An earthquake of organizational forms, seeding a tsunami of human chaos. There's a right kind of liquidity and a wrong kind of liquidity, the internet of drownership. So, palate cleanse, we're going to come back into the realm of the real. And the thing I want to hold in our minds as we move through the next few slides and next few concepts is this idea that we should arbitrage against the machine. So, one more palate cleanser, and then we'll get to something a bit more substantive. Fractals don't care about your feelings. Systems disregard their externalities, and formalisms cannot reason about the real. So, here's a meme, and I think it sums up where we are in the world today, 2024. Financial growth, exponential financial growth on a planet with finite resources. And in the bottom right quadrant, some of you might know the game Universal Paperclips. I think it's quite apt when we're talking about Web3, blockchain technology, and automation. You start off as a humble paperclip merchant, clicking a button to turn a strip of metal into a paperclip. And as time goes on, you get tools. You can automate, you can accelerate. And the game ends with you controlling a squadron of hyperdimensional intelligences, stripping the universe for all useful material. And that's kind of what I see in today's market-based, turbocharged capitalism. Another meme. In the top left, it's a slide from an IBM computer presentation in the late 70s. A computer can never be held accountable. Therefore, a computer must never make a management decision. But I think in 2024, we might be closer to the bottom left, where a computer can be management. And Joey Tribbiani is perhaps right to show some concern, in my opinion. So where does this all come from? Where's the swamp from which this all rises? In my opinion, I see the logics of scarcity and the ideologies that are accompanied by it as one of the kind of the chief drivers of some of these kind of, let's say, competitive and adversarial mindsets we see in the agoras of the marketplaces in the present day. Okay, one more palate cleanser. The church and the network, zeal and time, death and money, all sides of the same coin. And which coin are we talking about? Well, it's the coin that started all off, Bitcoin. And I know we're at the Web3 summit now, and like the world of Web3 seems to have diverged quite far from the world of proof of work and Bitcoin. But that is where all of this came from. And I think that Bitcoin still casts quite a long shadow over a lot of this space. So one of the most amazing things about Bitcoin is it is a time machine. It is a chronogenic apparatus. It creates a new logic of time that is divorced from the calendar, from the clock, from the sun, moon, and stars. And this is the first time we've ever created a truly synthetic, machinic temporality, a new temporal regime. That's amazing. Unfortunately, the way that the Bitcoin clock works, we know about the mining, you're doubtless familiar with it. Every time a block is found, we can think of the hand of the clock moving, incrementing one. The quality of a clock is only as good as the regularity, the cadence of its ticks. And so the way that Bitcoin keeps the ticks relatively constant is by changing the probability of one cycle of work finding a block, the difficulty adjustment algorithm. But because of this adjustment, to keep the clock ticking in an orderly fashion, there is no upper limit to the amount of energy that Bitcoin desires. It is insatiable. And not only that, it's also insensate. It lacks the capabilities to understand its consequences, the externalities it pushes outside of its environs. All that it cares about is that the piper is paid. And we pay the piper with energy, good old-fashioned cycles of computation and electricity. So you've probably all seen these graphs of hash rates going up and up and up and up. You might have also seen some of the examples of the externalities of these things, such as fires, floods, the takeover of disused mining facilities after regulatory changes, and even, strangely enough, some positive externalities, like if you put a series of Bitcoin mining rigs on top of stranded fracking, to burn the stranded gas from fracking wells, you're actually kind of doing something carbon positive there, which is interesting, but not most of where the mining is happening. And just to bring us up to date, that is what the chart looks like last time I looked. It is just going up and up and up, save a few fluctuations. So where's all this energy coming from? We now see academic studies that suggest that the climate impact of Bitcoin mining is now greater than the climate impact of gold mining. You know, when we dig holes in the ground and pump it full of chemicals to get the precious rocks out. And so we are reaching the point now where the externalities, the consequences of these network technologies are starting to make a dent at the global stage, and these things deserve global attention. Not that I have a solution on how to fix it. I'm just telling you that the problem is increasing and it's at quite a scope. I think one other thing that we can't avoid when we talk about Bitcoin is the socio part of the socio-technical system that is a cryptocurrency or a blockchain network. There's always been this hyper-individualist, dare I say even libertarian, right-wing ethos, streak that runs through the community that formed around Bitcoin. I think it's worth remembering that 50% of all of the coins that will ever be mined in Bitcoin, 10.5 million coins, were given out before the first halving. So that's between 2009 and 2013, where probably only a few people in this room will have heard of this thing at all. And so who's got all those coins? Who are now these new elites, these new billionaires? Well, it's mostly right-wing libertarian nutbars, as far as I can tell. And you can see some of their tweets online, such as saying things like, we need to burn more coal, we need to burn more coal to put more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere so that we can green the planet again. So this is the kind of infallible logics of the Bitcoin maximalist. And all of this carries echoes of a concept which I find very useful, both in this context and other ones, and that is Kara Daggett's concept of petro-masculinity. I'm going to read you a little quote. As the planet warms, new authoritarian movements in the West are embracing a toxic combination of climate denial, racism, and misogyny. Petro-masculinity appreciates the historic role of forest fossil fuel systems in buttressing patriarchal rule, as anxieties aroused by the Anthropocene augment desires for authoritarianism. Petro-masculinity suggests that fossil fuels mean more than profit. They contribute to making identities. Through a psychopolitical reading of authoritarianism, fossil fuel use can function as a violent reactionary practice. And that's an edited quote from Kara Daggett. Here's an example of a petro-masculinist. This person says they used to mine Bitcoin with Satoshi back in 2009, 2010. And then somehow their hard drive ended up in the bin and in the local dump. And this person has spent probably about a decade by now trying to persuade the municipality of a poor part of the UK to dig up the dump so they can find their hard disk and question mark, profit. So this person, purely motivated by their incentives, enrichment, is okay with causing an ecological disaster in this poor part of the post-industrial UK. So there's a great example for you. I also see it in the way that the Bitcoiners represent themselves. So this is a poster from a Bitcoin conference in Malta in 2019. And I'll just tell you that in another universe, I might have been on this poster because I applied to speak at this conference back in my Bitcoin days. And it's just as well that I'm not on the slide, otherwise I'd look like a bit of a hypocrite now. And so where's all this coming from? As some of you might have heard of this kind of idea of neo-reactionary philosophy or the Dark Enlightenment. But I'm reframing this rather as the Dork Enlightenment. I don't think these people are scary. I think that they come from a place of hurt and a place of inadequacy. And so the thing about Bitcoin that's very interesting, perhaps the most interesting thing, is that Satoshi disappeared over a decade ago by now. And so some of the Bitcoiners see this as an immaculate conception. And it's very fitting that I find myself behind this beautiful organ in this like quasi-religious setting. We've always been looking for people or things to project the extra mundane onto to find a sense of purpose. And in Bitcoin's natively horizontalized space, there are no explicit rulers. So that means people just show up and put on laurel wreaths and crowns and all the rest of it. At one point, we had a guy who called himself Bitcoin Jesus, and then the TV and everyone else started calling him that. Now, he would be considered more of a Bitcoin Judas. And on the left of the slide, you've got a very famous, by now very famous meme from, I think, the ICO era, 2016-17, of Vitalik holding a Lambo dressed as a prophet, beckoning you to the promised land. And so I wanted to read you a little quote from where this research was last year. And there's an essay with this title on 0x Folklore, if anyone's interested to read it. For as long as there's been financial capital, risk and speculation have orbited, manipulated, and harnessed it as narrative feedback machines, simultaneously reading and rewriting realities. Markets exist as a distributed conversation amongst speculators driven by profit motives and an appetite for divination and prophecy. Today, new strains of techno-colonialism are emerging, which are the latest of a series of echoes throughout Western history. An ascendant cabal of elites are attempting to reshape the world in their favor whilst hiding in plain sight behind the technologies that have enriched them. Theirs is a Promethean zealotry without faith, affecting an aura of divine sanction for the purposes of elevating the ego, enriching the chosen ones, and creating empires of varying stripes. But was it not always so? And so what's the job of the prophet, if not to lead the faithful to the promised land? But because the nation state, the Westphalian nation state system, mandates exclusive sovereignty over a contiguous territory, there's not much room left on this planet in reality. And so people, enterprising would-be imperialists, have been looking for new horizons. They might be in the sea, such as Sealand and the seasteading projects of the last few years. They might be in the metaverse. They might even be in places where nation states daren't reach. And so the example on the picture on the top left is from Liberland, which is a piece of swamp between Serbia and Croatia, which, based on the terms of a peace treaty, neither country can occupy lest it triggers another war. So some enterprising Bitcoiner showed up and put his flag in it, and that is Liberland now. And he can't actually live there, but it does seem he has some kind of claim, if not a claim of presence. They make a claim in terms of other forms of legitimacy. And here's some pictures of the metaverse headquarters of Liberland, designed by the same famous Zaha Hadid architects. So we're looking for new frontiers. There have been many examples. The graveyard is filling up of islands, cruise ships, gated communities. We now have a Bitcoin-friendly president in El Salvador, as I'm sure many of you are aware. Nayib Bukele wants to build a Bitcoin city, but is instead busy building high-tech jails and putting everyone in prison. Oh, yeah, we said that. That's fine. And but now what I see is like a new wave of more explicitly like old-style colonial projects which want to occupy physical territory and create new kinds of societies, exit from the communities that we have today, and build new kinds of social formations. And there's examples such as Aleph, Praxis, and even Urbit is, well, RIP Urbit, but Urbit is in there somewhere as well. I want to just say something a bit more about Praxis on the left and Prospera on the right, because these projects are actually quite far advanced, both in terms of mind share, but also in terms of capital. So Praxis is backed by Pronomos, which is Patry Friedman from the seasteading days, and Teal is also somewhere in the background. And Prospera is like they already have a city on the Honduran island of Roatan, where with the previous administration, they managed to garner some large exceptions to the rules of Honduras, and they're now attempting to be walked back by the new government. And there are enormous lawsuits going through international trade organizations right now on that one. And the title of the talk is The Chainmail Gaze, which I still haven't got to why that is, but I kind of think that the people from Praxis are trolling me because they posted less than a week ago this picture of the Praxis chainmail, which is never sold, only bestowed. So maybe that could be yours one day. So let's talk about this concept of the network state, which in my opinion is animating, or like is the latest example of one of these kind of secessionary desires from the outside. This is a quote from Balaji Srinivasan's book, The Network State, with a pretty succinct description. A network state is a social network with a moral innovation, a sense of national consciousness, a recognized founder, a capacity for collective action, an in-person level of civility, an integrated cryptocurrency, a consensual government limited by a social smart contract, an archipelago of crowd-funded physical territories, a virtual capital, and an on-chain census that proves a large enough population, income, and real estate footprint to attain a measure of diplomatic recognition. The two things I want to draw your attention to there are recognized founder and diplomatic recognition. So it's from this from these two that this idea of the chainmail gaze comes from. So many of you are doubtless familiar with the idea of the male gaze and the infringements and the externalities that male desires can cause. Well, what about the chainmail gaze, the 1,000-year stare of European imperialism? That sounds like a spicy project, and it is. I don't know if anyone's seen Kingdom of Heaven, the Ridley Scott movie. It's one of the worst movies about the Crusades, but it's one of the best movies about network states. And that's the move that we're doing here. We're equating not necessarily the Crusades themselves, but the institutions, the kingdoms, and the states that were made in the wake of the papal call to retake Jerusalem to these would-be imperialists and their network state desires. So let me read you about the nightwork state. Today's tech overlords are the descendants of Europe's crusaders, well-financed, zealous fanatics, wreaking destruction on the planetary other in the name of their greater good. The Vatican sponsored waves of Levantine invasions that began in the late 11th century with the midwife of capitalism, colonialism, and technology as we know it today. With the network state organizational concept, a cadre of powerful ideologues blessed with tokenized wealth are reshaping national frontiers, mirroring the desires of Frankish noblemen and their knightly orders in the Levant 1,000 years ago. So there's this quote from George Santayana, which many of you are probably familiar with, that those who do not remember history are condemned to repeat it. And that's one of the issues I see in this kind of these new ideologies that come out of the tech world, that there's not a lot of historical context given. So people often end up repeating mistakes, thinking they're doing something new. And that's why we're calling back to the Middle Ages. So on the top left, there's a map of the Crusader states that the mostly Frankish noblemen created after the fall of Jerusalem in 1099. They lasted for a couple of hundred years in various constitutions. And because we're in Germany in 2024, I won't say out loud the thing which my book is predicated on, but you will notice some similarities between the map of the Crusader states and another interesting country, nation state, that exists today, that is also on the eastern banks of the Levant. Okay, we're reaching the end now. I want to tell you about the PayPal mafia. And that's PayPal as in the money transaction thing, and papal as in the Pope. The balance of power across Eurasia 1,000 years ago was not so different from that of today. The imperial hangover from righteous European patriarchs, believing themselves to hold honorable intentions, noble birthrights, and virtuous ideals, lives on in the present cultural imaginary under late capitalism, looting the intellectual and material riches of foreign lands under an array of pretexts has always been the default mode of Occidental barbarity. And this idea of the Crusades, ironically, didn't exist at the peak of this theatre of conflict, of operation. It was a post hoc rationalization, but it's one that has lived on, especially in Western society. So Dwight Eisenhower named D-Day, and indeed his autobiography, A Crusade in Europe. George Bush famously called his post-9/11 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the whole project for a new American century a crusade in itself. And he later said that God told him to do that. Erdogan and Osama bin Laden from the Eastern sphere have also referenced the idea of the crusade in recent times. And the idea of the Crusades started off as a very specific thing, but then it kind of fanned out over time to be almost anything that the Pope would give sanction for. Not necessarily a religious war, not necessarily one against Muslims or residents of Jerusalem or Constantinople, or the perceived principal belligerents. It could be anything and against anyone. So the Teutonic Knights from Germany actually conducted an endless crusade against the Polish and Lithuanian people of Livonia. That was pagans, to educate them from their heresies, for example. And I just want to finish with one of the most interesting examples from this 200-year theatre of the Crusades, which is the Fourth Crusade. And I think the first one is relatively well known. That is like the knights came from Europe and they conquered Jerusalem and they made a kingdom there and a few other kingdoms that we just discussed. The Second and Third Crusades you could think of as stalemates. And by the time the Fourth Crusade came about in 1202, there was no land on the Levant. The Crusaders had lost all the land, and the locals had united under Salah ad-Din, an Arabized Kurd, to retake that. So they were based like in Cyprus and offshore. So the idea with the Fourth Crusade was that the crusading orders, such as the Knights Templar, would commission the Serene Republic of Venice to build ships for a whole year to take 30,000 knights and their retinue to Alexandria, which is where Saladin's caliphate was based, not Jerusalem, Alexandria. Not enough people came, and they didn't have enough money. So then the Crusaders, in essence, entered the service of the Venetians as mercenaries. And the Venetians were, to a first approximation, capitalists first and Christians second, as opposed to the monks, one could argue. And so the Venetians immediately set about settling scores and raiding their rivals, such as the Dalmatian port of Zadar, today in Croatia. And they ended up in Constantinople, where after a botched attempt to restore a usurper to the throne, who promised them the money, they ended up burning, sacking, destroying, raping. No small amount of Latin Christians. The Greek Christians. This was the capital of the Greek part of the Roman Empire, Byzantium, you could say, Eastern Rome. And so this was Christians killing mostly other Christians. There weren't many Muslims there. And they took stuff, looted it, plundered it, and then they left, but not before they installed a Latin Empire, which existed from 1210 till 1261. And so I just want to finish with this quote from a medieval scholar, Speros Veronis. The Greeks were convinced that even the Turks, had they taken the city, would not be as cruel as the Latin Christians. The defeat of Byzantium, already in a state of decline, accelerated political degeneration so that the Byzantines eventually became easy prey to the Turks. The Fourth Crusade, and the crusading movement generally, thus resulted ultimately in the victory of Islam, as a result which was, of course, the exact opposite of its original intention. And this is the take-home message from this 1,000 years of imperialist history, is that when capital gets involved, the risk or the potential for unforeseen consequences spirals, magnifies. And so I just want to leave you with a couple of memes, and I would suggest that the cure to male loneliness is not to retake Constantinople. Thank you for your time.